Welcome to our introductory mini lecture for cultural geography, specifically looking at human geography through a cultural lens. Human geography is the study of relationships and interactions between people and their surroundings. So a cultural approach to human geography means that we'll be emphasizing meanings, values, attitudes, and beliefs. In particular, that different groups of people derive from both places and spaces, two key concepts that come up commonly throughout this course. So in terms of understanding what culture is, since we're taking a cultural approach, we need to understand that culture can mean a lot of different things. For the purposes of this course, we can understand it as the total way of life held in common by a group of people, including learned features in particular, such as speech, ideology, behavior, or we can think of culture with a broader framing, such as the local or customary way of doing things, even a way of life. And this is an ever-changing process in which a group is actively engaged. And it can also be a dynamic mix of symbols, beliefs, speeches, and practices. And we'll see a lot of this as we go along throughout this chapter and throughout the course. So on that note, you need to understand a few of the characteristics of culture, such as that it's not static, and this means that it changes over time. It's a process. So culture involves a lot of different inner workings and changes through time. Cultures are never internally homogeneous. They're very variable and variegated, and we'll take a closer look at that as we go. There are 5 main themes in human geography. Each unit will go through each of these 5 themes, looking at particular phenomena through almost we can think of the themes as lenses. The first one is region. So what is a region? This is a geographical unit based on the characteristics and functions of culture in this case. Geographers recognize 3 types: formal, functional, and vernacular. Formal, we'll go through the 3 of them here briefly. Formal is a cultural region inhabited by people who have one or more cultural traits in common. Wheat cultivation is a good example, and this represents the formal region at the simplest level because it's based on a single cultural trait. So we can think of areas in the American West and the prairies, plains, where wheat cultivation is very common. This could be a formal region. Formal regions rarely have sharp boundaries. This is because they overlap and mix. And so we like to think of border zones rather than lines in the case of formal regions. Oftentimes they develop into the core periphery pattern, which we'll take a look at in future units as well. But this is where the characteristics weaken as you move farther from the core. So we could think about moving north from San Francisco Bay, how the cultural diversity, ethnic diversity begins to weaken, even decline as you move farther from the bay to the north. This would be a good example of the core periphery pattern compared to the core of Oakland or San Francisco being very ethnically diverse. And secondly, we have the functional region, which is a cultural area that functions as a unit politically, socially, or economically. Commonly they'll have nodes or central points where the functions are coordinated. Most of the time they have clearly defined borders, and they generally don't coincide spatially with formal regions. A great example would be Verizon Wireless's map of cell coverage. Very defined borders, oftentimes with specific nodes. In this case it could be cell towers or large urban areas. In this case, here's an aerial view of Denver. This image illustrates the node of the functional region here being the dense cluster of commercial buildings downtown. Oftentimes this is a financial district or even downtown itself. We could pause here and think about identifying the border of this functional region. Is that possible, and why or why not? And lastly, there's the vernacular region, perceived cultural region, perceived by its inhabitants. based on a collective spatial perception of the population. And some of the basic principles here is that sometimes they are physical environmental features, and other times it's based on economic or political characteristics. They generally lack short borders as well, and they can vary in scale. A great example of the vernacular region is the Redneck Riviera, the coastline in Florida's Panhandle region. The second main theme in geography is mobility. And mobility refers to the relative ability of people, ideas, things to move freely through space. And this is brings to mind the importance of looking at diffusion, which is the movement of people or things from one location outward to other locations. And geography takes a strong look at these dynamics. Example here mapped out would be the case of the diffusion, also the mobility of influenza infections during the H1N1 pandemic of 2009. So we see strong regional concentrations in Western Europe and Central America. Migrations of people also are commonly looked at within mobility and diffusion. Here we see a picture of the demonstrations in Hamburg, Germany against the deportation of immigrants. You could pause the video here and think about, to get our brainstorming activities on, do you think transnational migrants should be able to move without the restriction of their home countries, between their home countries and where they work? And why or why not? So this starts to speak to many of the themes that we'll look at within this course. Labor, migrations, national boundaries. And on that note, the third main theme of geography is globalization. We could think of globalization simply as the interdependence of economic, political, social processes on an increasingly global scale, and especially at an increasing speed. So interdependence is the relations between regions or countries of mutual but not necessarily equal dependence. A great example were the global colonial empires. Globalization beginnings are commonly thought to date to the 20th century, but different countries in different parts of the world have long been linked. It's important to remember. Current globalization is created from faster and more reliable transportation, and especially almost the instantaneous communication and the creation of digital sources of information and media. Some people would point to the online college courses now being an example of some globalization that can occur, especially when folks are taking courses from overseas, internationally. And oftentimes the question is asked, does globalization lead to cultural homogenization? It's important to point out that increasingly interdependent politics, economics, cultural networks, this might lead to different groups of people to become more and more alike, but these new global encounters have also enabled increasing recognition of differences between groups. Certainly though, there's a strong pattern of uneven development, a tendency for industry to develop in that core peripheral pattern, and oftentimes enriching the industrialized country at the core and impoverishing the less industrialized periphery. So here we have a map of the Human Development Index. Development Index includes the life expectancy, adult literacy, educational participation, also gross domestic product, which is the most common economic measure of development that we usually see mapped out and referred to. All these statistics are brought together to create a measure of development that's more balanced, one compared to one that's only based on economic growth. So it's a good thing that we're able to keep in mind as we move forward. The fourth main theme is nature culture. Human environment relations is another way we'll sometimes see that written out. And geographers view the relationship between people and nature as a two-way interaction, that they're completely embedded and reciprocal. This helps investigate how groups of people interact with Earth's biophysical environment and examine how culture, politics, economies of those groups affect the ecological situation and resource use. One interesting case of nature-culture interaction would be the triple disaster of 2011 in Japan. Started with an earthquake, very strong, 9.0 magnitude. This in turn triggered tsunamis, and then the tsunamis disrupted the nuclear power stations, which were already been affected by the earthquake. So not only was there infrastructure destruction, and there was flooding, then we had a very lethal case of nuclear fallout. On a smaller scale, we can look within the nature-culture lens simply at human modification of the earth. In this case, in safari expeditions in Africa, leading to severe soil erosion. We can begin to question how we manage for tourism, how we manage for energy production, what type of relationship different cultures have in these forms of modes of production. And along this note, the fifth main theme in geography is cultural landscape. This refers to the visible human imprint on the land, whether it be in wild or urban areas or any point in between. And what we find is that landscape reflects the culture's needs, values, and attitudes towards the earth. The human geographer can learn much about a group of people by carefully observing and studying the landscape. So this case of the terraced rice paddies of Indonesia, we can begin to question, why is rice cultivated in hilly areas in Asia, whereas in the US, rice farming is confined to flat plains? And why is it important to study cultural landscape? This visually reflects one of the most basic strivings of humankind: shelter, food, clothing, all of that we can see in the cultural landscape and help understand cultures. Reveals the people's attitudes towards the modification of Earth. We see vastly different forms of modifying the Earth and when we go around the world. So understanding that gives us keen insights into understanding the cultures that are there. And it contains valuable evidence about the origin, spread, and development of cultures. So a historical element, harkening back to the mobility of certain factors in cultures. And then also it conveys the messages about present-day inhabitants and cultures. So a kind of combination of all these factors, we're able to see very prescient insights into what's going on in today's culture. For instance, here in Tokyo, Yokohama, see the very pronounced skyline symbolizing, a symbol of economic importance in the world's largest city. Maybe pause for a moment here and question what landscape best symbolizes your own town or city, whether that be in the Bay or abroad. Here's another example from the US, the American ranch house. Very horizontally expansive, very common house across the US and Canada. Maybe we can wonder where else we might find ranch houses, but what does it say about our interaction with the landscape? Large lawns, very expansive in terms of space between the houses, very different from other areas in the world. So aspects of cultural landscape include settlement forms, land division patterns, and also architectural styles. So land division patterns, we can refer to the spatial patterns of different land uses. These can vary greatly from place to place, culture to culture. It's also land is divided and subdivided in different ways, especially for economic versus residential versus political uses. Here we can see the aerial view of the town of Westmoreland in the Imperial Valley of California. We're here comparing two landscapes in Ontario, Canada, Toronto versus downtown. So yeah, please